In May of 2019, a hydrologist named Renata Scholes knelt at the base of a cleared ridge in Clearwater County, Montana, and held a flow meter in a trickle of water that had not been officially measured since 1958. She had driven up from Billings with a folded USGS map, a field notebook, and the professional composure of someone who does not allow herself to get ahead of the data. The trickle had surprised her in October. She had come back in May, to be sure. Harlan Voss stood a few feet behind her, watching her write something in the notebook. He did not ask what she was writing. He had the patience of a man who had waited 5 years already and had concluded that one more minute was not the point. When she stood and read the number aloud, a small group of neighbors who had walked over from the county road went quiet in a way that is not quite silence. It is the particular stillness that happens when something that has been dismissed for years turns out to have been right all along, and nobody knows yet what to do with that. Renata said the number plainly, the way trained people say numbers when they want the number to be the thing and not themselves. Then she looked at the 1958 USGS map and looked back at the cleared ridge above them and said she had not expected this. That was May of 2019. Let me go back to March of 2016 to a stockman's meeting in a metal-sided community building 12 miles south of town and tell you what happened in between. Because what happened in between was 5 years of a man working a horse hitch across stumped-out fur ground while his county looked on with the sympathetic patience people reserve for a neighbor whose methods they respect without intending to copy. And what happened in between was also a spring that nobody alive had seen running, coming back. The meeting was called to discuss grazing improvement grants available through the University Extension Office. Dale Pruitt, the county extension director, had driven out from Missoula with a laptop and a 40-slide presentation. He was 47 years old and had a master's degree in range science from Montana State and a genuine conviction that the right data, applied correctly, would improve any operation. He was not wrong about that as a general principle. He was also that March about to make an assessment that would take him 3 years to revise. The narrator insists plainly that he was a man who had spent his career trying to help people, and that counted for something. And the mistake he made was a sincere one. When the presentation reached the section on land improvement, Pruitt put up a slide comparing mechanized stump removal costs with conventional revitation timelines, and looked out over the 22 ranchers sitting on folding chairs in that room. He had a clean green university fleece, a clipboard he had set on the table beside the laptop, and the calm manner of a person whose recommendations have generally worked out. Harlan Voss was in the back row. Most people in Clearwater County knew Harlan by reputation, though the reputation was hard to describe in fewer than a paragraph. He was 71 years old, barrel-chested and deliberate, with a gray stubble jaw and wide, flat hands that looked like they had been worked for 50 years because they had. He was known for his horses and for his silence, in roughly that order. Pruitt said that anyone still trying to clear old timber ground with draft horses was, in his professional estimation, pursuing a logging hobby rather than a land improvement strategy. He said it with the measured sympathy of a man who understands that sentiment is not nothing, but that a balance sheet is a balance sheet. He showed a slide, dozer clearing at $12 an acre, projected timeline of 1 to 2 seasons to productive pasture. He did not show a slide for the method he was dismissing because no institution had quantified it. The man sitting 2 chairs from Harlan in the back row glanced over at him. Harlan was looking at the slide. His expression did not change. He did not say anything that night. A few ranchers came up to Pruitt after, with questions about the grant applications. Harlan pulled his coat on and walked to the parking lot and drove home on the county road, with the window cracked. Despite the cold, the way he always did, thinking the way he thought about most things, which was to turn something over once and set it down and let it sit until he had time to look at it properly. At home, Bess and the 5 other lead horses in the working hitch were in the shed, blowing steam in the barn light, their harness hung and their buckets filled. Bess was the gray Percheron, 14 years old, who had been Harlan's lead mare since he brought her up from a breeder in Wyoming in 2009. She was not the largest horse in his operation, and she was not always the strongest. She was the most settled, which is a quality in a draft horse that is worth more than either size or strength when the work is long and the ground is uncertain. Harlan stood in the shed door for a few minutes, with his hand on her neck, not saying anything, and then went inside. Let me tell you what Harlan Voss was actually doing on that ridge, because Dale Pruitt's slide deck could not have shown you, and because understanding it is the only way the rest of this story makes sense. Harlan's father, Earl Voss, had worked the same 340 acres in the 1,950 seconds and early 1,960 seconds using a 12-horse hitch to pull Douglas fir stumps from the lower ridge, ground his own father had logged and left rough. It was a standard ledger format journal, its cover gone soft and dark with handling, and in it he recorded everything, a man on working ground records, which was the teams and the weather and the stump counts, the ground conditions after each pull, the way the soil behaved in the first wet spring after a section was cleared. In the spring of 1958, when the USGS was mapping groundwater resources across the county, a surveyor noted a spring at the base of that same ridge running at 4.2 gallons per minute. Inute Earl wrote about it in the logbook. He called it the bench spring. He wrote that it had been there as far back as anyone on the place could remember, that it ran clean and cold from April to October in most years, and that his mother had set her milk jars in the pool it made below the boulder at the base of the draw. A commercial timber operation leased the upper ridge ground in the early 1,960 seconds and brought tracked machinery onto land that had never seen it. By the early 1,970 seconds, the bench spring had stopped running. The County Water Board noted its absence in the 1972 survey and listed it as an inactive seep, which in bureaucratic language means that nobody is going to worry about this anymore. The ground above it had been compacted by tracked machinery, and the capillary structure of the soil had been changed in a way nobody connected to the spring's disappearance at the time. Earl died in 1989 and left Harlan the logbook and 340 acres and a note inside the front cover that read, "Pull the root ball whole. The water follows the air." Harlan spent 11 years thinking about that line before he understood it fully. By 2014, when he was 66 years old and had been working the same ground for 3 decades, he had turned it over enough times to begin. Here is what a draft horse does to a Douglas fir stump that a diesel dozer cannot replicate, and that no University Extension slide deck had modeled as of March 2016. A Caterpillar D6 dozer, clearing a stump, applies downward and lateral crushing pressure from its blade. The stump breaks below grade. The root ball is severed and left in place, or pushed into a burn pile. The track system running across that ground applies up to 11 pounds per square inch of direct contact pressure to the soil surface. That pressure is enough to collapse the capillary pore structure of a mineral soil to a depth of 12 to 18 inches. Those pores are the arteries of the ground. They are the pathways by which rainwater and snowmelt enter the soil column rather than sheeting off the surface. Seal them. And you have made the land functionally impermeable in a way that looks like bare dirt from the road, but performs like pavement in a wet year and concrete in a dry one. The lateral roots, left in place, rot slowly, and as they rot, they do not open channels into the soil. They collapse the pore spaces around themselves as the wood softens. The hydraulic architecture of the soil, the fine and medium and coarse pores that allow infiltration, is degraded. Rain that falls on that ground has nowhere to go but sideways and downhill, fast, carrying the surface soil with it. What Harlan did instead was this. He rigged a 6-horse hitch, Bess at the lead, using a single tree attachment and a leverage chain wrapped around the root ball of the stump, at grade or just below it. 6 Percheron crosses, each weighing 1,100 to 1,200 pounds, apply their combined draft in a sustained upward and lateral pull. Not a blow, not a crushing push. A long, patient ground-level leverage that builds slowly and holds until the root system releases from the soil column intact. The root ball comes out whole, the lateral roots attached and unbroken, the channel those roots occupied left open in the soil as a clean walled cavity. That cavity from the root collar down to the deepest taproot, and laterally to the outermost fine roots, is what hydrologists call an infiltration gallery. It is a conduit from the soil surface down into the subsoil along which water can travel freely rather than running off. It is, in the specific soil conditions of that ridge, roughly 14 inches in diameter at the crown of the pull and between 3 and 6 feet deep. Earl had not known the term infiltration gallery. He had known the result. Pull the root ball whole. The water follows the air. Over 6 seasons working the lower ridge ground from 2014 to 2019, Harlan pulled stumps from 1/8A of his 340 acres. He worked in hitches of 6 horses at a time, rotating the teams through the season, keeping records in his own ledger the way his father had. He counted stumps as he worked and estimated an average of 40 per acre on the old Douglas fir ground. 40 stumps per acre across 180 acres is 7,200 root ball pulls. 7,200 infiltration galleries, each averaging 14 inches in diameter at the crown and running 3 to 6 feet into the subsoil, distributed across 180 acres of ridge ground above the bench where the old spring had run. Over those 6 seasons, those galleries connected to each other through the soil's existing pore structure, the way a network of tributaries connects to a river. And the ground began to breathe in a way it had not breathed since the tracked machines sealed it in the 1,960 seconds. Below the ridge, at the bench where Earl had set his mother's milk jars in a pool, the aquifer fracture that had fed the spring began slowly and invisibly to recharge. Harlan did not know in 2014 that the spring would come back. He knew what his father had written. He knew what the ground told him season by season, which was that the cleared acres held moisture through dry stretches that turned the uncleared parts to dust. He filed that away and kept working. If you have ever pulled a stump with a horse hitch, you know that the moment of release is different from what you expect. There is a long period of nothing happening. The horses leaning into their collars, the chain singing tight, the ground holding. Then, something shifts in the root geometry below grade, and the whole thing releases at once, not with a bang, but with a low, sustained groan and a pop, and the root ball comes up with the soil still packed in its architecture. Harlan had watched that happen 7,200 times across those 6 years, and never once stopped watching it carefully. He was not working in a vacuum. Nels Barch ran 480 acres across the ridge on the other side of the county road and had watched Harlan's horse operation with the tolerant interest of a man who respects a neighbor without planning to imitate one. Nels was 63, with a capable operation and good records and a rotation that had served him well. He had 180 acres of the same old, fir-stump ground Harlan was clearing, and by the fall of 2016 he had decided it was time to deal with it. He had heard Dale Pruitt's presentation at the stockmen's meeting. The numbers made sense. That same fall, Pruitt had driven out to the Voss place for a site visit. He walked the cleared acres with a soil probe and his clipboard, measuring moisture readings at 12-inch depth on the gallery ground and comparing them to adjacent uncleared stump ground. The gallery acres read higher. Pruitt attributed this to the removal of the fir canopy and improved seed contact with the mineral soil after the stumps were gone. He wrote that in his notes. He did not attribute the moisture retention to the gallery architecture because the gallery architecture was not a variable his model included. He had not been trained to look for it, and the absence of a variable in a model is not the same as evidence that the variable does not exist, though in practice people treat it that way. He stood at the edge of Harlan's cleared ground and looked at the hitch standing in the adjacent uncleared section, Bess easy in her collar, steam coming off her in the October cold, and he told Harlan with genuine care in his voice that what Harlan was running was a logging hobby that was going to leave him in stumps while his neighbors got ahead. He said he wanted Harlan to be able to retire on his equity rather than his sentiment. He folded his clipboard and thanked Harlan for his time. Harlan thanked him for coming out. If you are wondering whether anyone in Clearwater County wanted to say something at that moment, the answer is that Harlan's granddaughter, Ivy, was not there yet. She was finishing her final semester in agricultural economics in Missoula. She would arrive the following summer with a degree and a set of spreadsheet models and a love for her grandfather that she had not yet learned to distinguish from doubt. If you have a question about the kind of farm a person builds when they work one piece of ground for 40 years and keep a ledger every season and refuse to be talked out of what the ledger says, drop that in the comments. I find that the people who understand this story best are usually the ones who have watched it happen somewhere in their own lives. We'll go on. By spring of 2017, Nels had borrowed $94,000 from the county ag lender to finance a D6 dozer rental and a 3-season herbicide program for the cheatgrass he expected to manage afterward. He cleared his 180 acres in a season and a half. The dozer was a fine machine, and Nels ran it with the efficiency he brought to everything on his operation. By the fall of 2017, his cleared ground looked clean and flat and ready for seed, the stumps buried or windrow burned, the surface smooth. He had spent $8,400 on the first season's herbicide application. His faith in the extension timeline was not unreasonable. 1 to 2 seasons of aggressive revegetation management, then productive pasture. It was what the data said. Ivy Voss arrived at the home place in June of 2017. She was 34 years old, a careful person who wrote things down and checked her arithmetic twice, and she loved Harlan in the way that someone raised, mostly on a working farm, loves the person who taught them what work meant. She also had a transcript full of production agriculture coursework and a set of honest professional opinions about the relative efficiency of horse-powered versus mechanized land improvement operations, and those opinions were not in her grandfather's favor. She spent her first week home walking the cleared ground and the uncleared ground and asking Harlan questions he answered in single sentences. She counted the horses in the shed. There were 28 in the operation at that point, some boarded for other operators, most of them working in the hitch rotation Harlan used on the ridge. When she borrowed his logbook one evening and read it at the kitchen table under the overhead light, the ledger open to the 1958 entries, her grandfather's father's handwriting even, and unhurried across the page. She found the note about the bench spring. She found the notation for the bench spring. 4.2 gallons per minute. Inute, April survey. She turned the book over and looked at the bench line below the ridge and tried to remember whether she had ever seen water there. As a child, she had not. She asked Harlan one evening on the porch whether he had run the cost per acre numbers on the horse method against the dozer quote Nels had taken. He said he had not. She said she had been working through it. He listened. She said that, even accounting for the boarding income from the outside horses, his effective cost per acre cleared was running between $48 and $60 against Nels's $12 dozer quote. He looked at her the way he looked at things he had already considered. He said that the numbers she had run did not include the spring. She asked him what spring. He nodded at the bench below the ridge and went inside. She sat on the porch a long time after that. The summer of 2017 was a normal moisture year, adequate and uneventful. Harlan's earliest cleared acres, the ones he had pulled from 2014 and 2015, were now 3 and 4 years into recovery. By late August, when the county typically saw a dry stretch before fall rains, Harlan's soil probe readings on those gallery acres were showing 1.8% volumetric water content at the 12-inch depth. The adjacent uncleared stump ground was at 9%. It was the same rain falling on both. The gallery architecture was the difference. Ivy walked both sections with him and looked at the numbers and did not say much. Across the road, Nels's cleared ground was already showing the early signs of what compaction does in a dry August. The surface crust was tight. The soil probe took more pressure to drive to 12 inches. The moisture reading at 12 inches was 6%. Nels had seeded ryegrass and a native fescue mix, and it was establishing, but it was establishing shallowly on the compacted pan. Nels was not worried. The extension timeline said this was normal. In the spring of 2018, at the Clearwater Co-op, Nels was talking to Ivy about the horse operation and the dozer comparison when she mentioned the moisture differential her grandfather was tracking on the gallery ground. Nels listened carefully. He was not a dismissive man. He thought for a moment and then said that he respected Harlan, but that what Harlan was doing was a logging hobby, and that at the end of the day you could not run a horse operation and expect to keep pace with the county's cost structure. He said it without malice. He had absorbed it from a source he trusted, and it fit the numbers he had, and there was no particular reason at that moment to doubt it. He would have reason within 3 months. The summer of 2018 arrived with a dry spring that got drier. Clearwater County recorded 0.47 inches of precipitation between April and the last week of July. The agricultural report that August called it the worst moisture deficit since 1988. Ranchers across the county were feeding out winter haystocks in July and pricing next year's grazing leases with reservation. The county average for dry matter yield on improved pasture that season came in at 0.8 tons per acre, against a normal year expectation of 1.6. In the decades of records the county extension office maintained, there was nothing comparable in living memory for severity in a summer month. On Nels Barch's cleared ground, the outcome was worse than the county average. The D6's track pressure had left a soil pan at 10 to 12 inches, that in a normal year costs an operation some efficiency, and in a drought year costs it the season. When 0.47 inches of rain fell on that compacted surface between April and July, the water sheeted off rather than infiltrating. The surface seal, invisible from the road but measurable with a probe, turned each rain event into a runoff event. What moisture did enter the top 2 inches of soil evaporated before root systems could use it. Cheatgrass, which establishes aggressively in disturbed, compacted soils and roots at 4 to 6 inches, moved into the gaps in Nels's fescue by June. By August, it was not a gap, it was a takeover. Cheatgrass is not worthless as forage in early spring, but it cures out by midsummer and drops in nutrition and palatability. And in a drought year, when you need every acre to yield, it is a disaster. Nels's 180 acres of cleared ground came in at 0.8 tons per acre in forage yield that season, which was the county average, except that Nels had spent $119,200 to put those 180 acres in production, and they were yielding what a non-cleared, unimproved acre yielded in the worst moisture year in 30 years. The $94,000 note on the dozer work was due in the spring of 2019, secured by pasture ground that a qualified appraiser would now value at substantially less than when the note was signed. Nels walked his cheatgrass that August with the measured expression of a man who has done everything he was told and is working out what that means. On Harlan's cleared ground, the gallery network held. When 0.47 inches of rain fell between April and July, it entered the soil rather than running off it. The infiltration galleries, the 7,200 root channel cavities Harlan had been building for 5 seasons, collected that rain and directed it into the subsoil rather than letting it sheet down the ridge. The root hairs of the recovering grass stand on the gallery ground, followed that moisture 12, 18, 24 inches into the profile. The pasture on the cleared gallery acres stayed green into late July. Harlan cut it once in June, and it came back. He did not cut it again, he let it root. The dry matter yield from the gallery ground that August was 2.1 tons per acre, against the county average of 0.8. In the worst moisture deficit in 30 years. Harlan did not point this out to anyone. He harvested what his ground gave and recorded the numbers in his ledger and spent his evenings with the horses. Bess had pulled through the spring mud of that year without complaint, the way she always did. She was working the southwest quarter of the ridge that season, the last major section of stump ground, and Harlan watched her collar work as the hitch leaned into a particularly deep-rooted fir ball and felt the ground give, and the root system come up whole the way it always did, the cavity left clean and open below. And he recorded it in the ledger that evening. Pull, 6,890, 14-inch, crown, clear to 4 feet. Ground conditions, wet but firm. In October of 2018, a seep appeared at the base of the cleared ridge, in the shallow draw where the bench spring had run in Earl Voss's time. Harlan saw it on a Thursday morning when he walked the fence line below the ridge, checking for wash damage after a rain event the previous weekend. The seep was not much. It was a wet ring in the soil, perhaps 18 inches across, at the base of the boulder the size of a kitchen table, that had sat there as long as the place had been the Voss place. He crouched over it for a long time. The soil around it was cold and smelled the mineral water and the faint iron smell of water that has come up from depth. He pressed his hand flat against the wet soil. Then he went inside and called the Department of Natural Resources office in Billings and described what he had to the main line. He gave the location, the coordinates off the paper map on the kitchen wall, the approximate size of the seep, and the reference to the 1958 USGS notation. The person who took the call said a hydrologist would be in touch. A senior hydrologist named Renata Scholes called back 3 hours later and told him she would drive up the following week. She arrived with the 1958 USGS map and her field notebook and a soil probe and a portable spectrometer and the focused manner of a scientist who has learned that interesting things tend not to stay interesting if you approach them carelessly. She walked the draw with Harlan without saying much for 2 hours, probing the soil at intervals above the seep, checking the temperature of the seep water with a thermometer she kept in her kit, making notes. She asked Harlan when the stump pulling operation had begun on the ridge. He said, 2014. She wrote that down. She asked about the horse method and the gallery architecture, and Harlan described it in the same plain sentences he used for everything. She took more notes. She told him she wanted to come back in May when the snowpack had run and the system had a chance to fully equilibrate. She said she was not prepared to put her name on anything until she had a May flow measurement. She said the seep was consistent with the recharge of a shallow perched aquifer through a restored infiltration pathway, and that if she was reading the geology correctly from the 1958 survey data, the fracture that had fed the original spring was still present below the bench. She said she had not expected to see this. Harlan said May was fine. What passed through Clearwater County over that winter was the kind of information that circulates among people who watch land for a living. By March, Nels Barch had heard about the seep from 3 separate sources. Ivy had called Dale Pruitt in February and told him what the October observation had been. Pruitt had listened carefully and said he would wait for the May data. Several ranchers had walked out to the bench to see the seep for themselves, and 2 of them had put their hands in the wet soil the way Harlan had in October, and come away quiet. One man, Carl Briggs, who ran cattle on the adjoining ground 2 miles below the bench and had been hauling water for his stock from a tank truck for 15 years, drove up twice to look at the seep and drove home both times. On the morning, Renata Scholes came back with the flow meter. 11 people were standing in that draw. She assembled the meter at the pool that had formed over the winter at the base of the boulder. Not a seep any longer, but a defined pool, 18 inches across, with a clean outflow channel. The frost cycles had opened. The pool was clear and cold, the discharge carrying a thread of current that cut a small groove in the soft soil below the boulder. Renata ran the flow measurement once, then twice to confirm. She wrote the number in her notebook. She looked at the 1958 USGS map, which she had kept folded in her jacket pocket since she arrived. She opened it and held it against her knee and looked at the number. Again, she looked up at Harlan, 3.9 gallons per minute in newt. The 1958 map had the bench spring noted at 4.2 gallons per minute in newt. 61 years and a compaction event and a D6's predecessor, and 7,200 horse-pulled root balls, and it was back at 93% of its historic flow rate. Renata said the number clearly and without preamble. The 11 people standing in that draw went quiet. The number sat in the air above the pool for a long moment. Nels Barch was there. He stood at the left edge of the group with his arms at his sides and looked at the pool, and then looked at the cleared ridge above it, and then looked at Harlan. He did not say anything. He was calculating something that had nothing to do with gallons per minute. Dale Pruitt had driven out from Missoula that morning. He was standing near the back of the group in his green extension fleece, the clipboard in his left hand. When the silence broke, when people started talking and moving toward the pool to look, he made his way through to where Harlan was standing. He asked quietly, without the clipboard in front of him this time, if he could see the logbook. not in the tone of a man reviewing a dataset. In the tone of a man who has been working from an incomplete model and has just had the gap named for him and wants to understand its shape. Harlan looked at him for a moment. Ivy Voss stood at the edge of the pool with her notebook. She had been there since before Renata arrived, and she had watched the meter go in and watched Renata write and watched the number get read. She wrote it in her own notebook, and then stood looking at the cleared ridge for a long time. She thought about the porch conversation in 2017, the cost per acre, comparisons she had run, the answer her grandfather had given. The numbers she had run did not include the spring. She understood now what that meant, not as a correction, as a lesson about what belongs in the model and what the model cannot hold. The water rights application went in that summer. Renata filed the technical support documentation, which included the 1958 USGS map, the May 2019 flow measurement, the soil permeability data she had collected at the gallery sites above the bench, and a short technical memo describing the infiltration gallery architecture and its hydrological effect. The spring was registered as an active stock water source in Harlan's name. 3 downstream landowners, including Carl Briggs, who had been running tank truck water for his cattle for 15 years, asked to negotiate shares. Harlan sat down with each of them at the kitchen table over 2 evenings and set the share price at what the hauling had been costing them, not at what a water rights attorney would have priced it for him. He refused to hire one. He said he wanted his neighbors to keep what the water was worth to them, not pay what a lawyer thought it was worth to him. The 3 share agreements were signed at the kitchen table and filed with the county in September. Nels refinanced his $94,000 note on terms that gave him 5 more years to rebuild the pasture value on the compacted acres. He seeded a native grass mix that fall with the help of a range specialist Dale Pruitt referred him to. The specialist told him that recovery from severe soil pan compaction with cheatgrass invasion would take 6 to 8 years. Nels said he understood. He asked Harlan the following spring whether there was anything that could be done on the compacted ground with a horse hitch to begin opening the pan. Harlan said he could do better than that. He hitched 6 horses and went across the road and spent 3 days demonstrating what an angled tine on a single tree could do to a compacted pan without adding track pressure. Nels took notes. He did not say anything about the logging hobby. By the summer of 2026, Clearwater County ranchers had come to Harlan and Ivy asking to see the horse clearing method demonstrated on their own stump ground. Ivy ran the program. She built a written protocol from the logbook and from the notes she had made during and after the May 2019 measurement, and she gave a printed copy to each operator who came through. She put Earl's principle at the top of the first page. Pull the root ball whole. The water follows the air. She gave a photocopy of the logbook, original pages photographed on the kitchen table, to Renata Scholes for the DNRC archive in Billings. Renata accepted it with the word of a scientist who wishes she had known about a thing earlier and is glad to have it now. Dale Pruitt came out in the fall of 2020 and spent an afternoon walking the gallery ground with Ivy, asking specific questions about the soil permeability data and the gallery dimensions and the timeline from pull to measurable infiltration gain. He had read Renata's technical memo twice. He took notes and asked good questions and said at the end of the afternoon that he had been working from a model calibrated on mechanized operations that had no variable for root channel hydrology and that he intended to write it up as a documented case study for the Extension Service and ask Renata to co-author it. He said it without excessive embarrassment, the way an honest person accounts for a gap in their knowledge when the evidence has been sufficient. Ivy said she thought that would be useful. She meant it without irony, which is the only honest way to mean something like that. Harlan kept 340 acres. He did not expand. He did not market the spring. He did not give interviews beyond Renata's documentation. He kept the logbook on the shelf above the kitchen table and worked the horse hitch through 2021 and into 2022, when his knees slowed him enough that Ivy took the lead lines. She ran the hitch the way he had taught her, which was the way Earl had taught him, which was the only way the ground responded to correctly. There are two ways to know a piece of ground. The first way is to measure it from above, model it, enter it into a system that tracks what it produces per acre and what it costs per season, and whether it trends above or below the county average. That knowledge is real. It can be printed, compared, funded, and cited. It fits on a slide. It does not fit on the ground it came from, which is a different kind of thing from fitting in a spreadsheet, and the difference matters when the dry year comes and the model and the ground disagree. The second way is to work one piece of ground long enough that the ground tells you things it does not tell people who are only passing through. To keep a ledger every season the way Earl kept his, and to read that ledger the way Harlan read it, not as a record of what had happened, but as a description of what the ground was doing. To understand that a spring at the base of a ridge is not just a water source, but a signal, and that the signal is connected to the soil architecture above it, and that the soil architecture is connected to what has been done to it over decades, and that what you do to 200 stumps with a horse hitch accumulates in the hydraulic record of the earth, the way compound interest accumulates in a ledger, slowly and invisibly, until the year the number becomes legible. Dale Pruitt's model was not wrong. It was incomplete the way a map is always incomplete, because a map can only hold what someone thought to measure when the map was made. The bench spring had been measured in 1958 and lost in 1972, and nobody had thought to measure the connection between those two events, because nobody had a variable for root channel hydrology. Now, there was a case study and a co-authored extension memo and a registration in the County Water Board records and a flow meter reading that said 3.9 gallons per minute in Newt, and the variable existed. What Harlan Voss and his father's logbook held was the thing nobody had thought to measure, and the measure of it, when it finally arrived, was a number read aloud beside a boulder at the base of a cleared ridge in May, after 61 years. What is rigid breaks, what the water follows, is air. Bess was 16 that summer, and she was not pulling heavy work anymore. She was in the pasture, above the bench spring, on clear evenings, grazing the bench grass that had come in strong along the outflow channel, her gray coat going silver in the late light. Ivy stood beside her some evenings with a hand on her neck, not saying much, looking at the thread of clear water moving below them, across the flat toward Carl Briggs's fence line. The water ran the way Earl's logbook said it always had, the way it was always going to run if the air was given back to it.